Hi, everyone. It is Thursday and the start of spring here in New York City. And we're trying to get through some difficult, challenging, ongoing, lingering times of the pandemic. And there's so much to talk about as we look ahead and we're thinking about planning for what's going to be our new working environments, our new working lives. What does it look like? And what are the fundamental factors that we need to be thinking about as we're planning? We're planning for, if we use the next normal, that new normal, what's it going to look like and what do we need to think about? Well, one of the key things, as you know, in my whole empathy journey is about having the right culture and having some values within that resonate with everybody, that really bring everybody, into the community, help them feel safe, help them feel belong. And that one of the key pieces of that is inclusion. So today I'm absolutely delighted to be talking with Gena Cox. And she is an inclusion strategist. And I love the title to begin with. And she is the founder of Feels Human, which is an inclusion strategy and coaching firm. And she's known for her multidisciplinary approach, which is very pragmatic and to solving human challenges at work, which there are so many of. She is an advisor and cheerleader for all her clients and a speaker, and she's actually working on a book, which is all, I will not spoil that. I will let her introduce herself, and we'll be talking later a little bit about her book. So I'm absolutely thrilled now to be welcoming Gena Cox.
And I am so thrilled to be here, Sophie. It's good to see you. Over the time that I have known you, one of the things that I really enjoy about you is all your energy. And I've told some friends that I was really looking forward to this conversation because you're such a great conversationalist and you will certainly guide this conversation in all the right nooks and crannies. So I'm looking forward to it.
And thank you, by the way. It's such a pleasure I love our chats. It's such a pleasure to also not only be talking to you, but have you wearing my accent color, which is red, and it looks fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
So I love, there's so much about your history that is rich and brings so much to the table for the discussions with clients, discussion about inclusion. I'd like to start with the fact that you studied industrial organizational psychology, and you're the second person that I've been talking to in the last, couple of weeks that's done this. And it's the most fascinating subject. Could you just explain what it means and what it does in terms of when you're studying that? What does that mean that you understand about our organizations and the people in it?
Well, there's a lot to say about that. I studied industrial and organizational psychology because when I was an undergrad, I had this amazing mentor. She had graduated from the University of Michigan School for Social Research. Galen Perrault is her name. And I had another amazing mentor then. Her name is Dr. Sandra Thompson, and both of them were researchers. And what they both taught me, which I had no idea about, was that there was an aspect of psychology that one could study and apply it in business environments. My dad had given me a developmental psychology textbook when I was a teenager, and I was already interested in psychology, but really didn't know about career options. So anyway, they were researchers, and they liked industrial and organizational psychology because how it differs from clinical or experimental or social or many of the other disciplines in psychology is that industrial and organizational psychology is really focused on the human element in organizations, in business settings. I like to say that it is not that long since humans started to work together in teams and groups, because up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the most that we were doing together was in an agrarian environment. But when you put a group of people together and ask them to perform a task for a desired outcome, there are all these dynamics that have to be considered. So one of the really nice things about industrial and organizational psychology is we're really trying to understand what's going on here with individuals and groups as they work together in business environments to accomplish a goal. Industrial and organizational psychologists do a variety of things, including ergonomics and human factors and designing cockpits and designing assessments and so on. I focus on the human experience in the work environment and organizational effectiveness. I'm not hearing you. Okay.
So when we're thinking about organizations and how people work together and how what they're bringing to the table and the challenges of all of that, this is what allows you to understand the dynamics between people in specifically in the work setting.
Absolutely. Yeah. My focus is on the work setting. I also want to know what's happening outside of the work setting, because especially now, it's pretty clear that a person shows up as a whole person. And, not all leaders have totally bought into the idea that, you can't leave your personal life behind and then sort of show up for work as the perfect employee. But I think the pandemic has taught us that, in fact, people can't live there. There's one person. And it's just that when they're in this work environment, they have a job to do.
So going back a sec to what the next step was in terms of you took this understanding of organizations, the dynamics within it, and a key place that you were working and applying that knowledge was at IBM. You were focused on the employee experience. How did that play out in terms of the different dynamics that you saw at play there, and what some of the challenges were?
I feel I need to back up a little bit.
Sure, absolutely, please.
Yeah, because what I really need for you to know is that when I finished a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology a few years ago, I had the most amazing opportunity to go to work for a company called Raymond James Financial, which is headquartered in St. Petersburg, Florida. And you may have seen the name of the company in NFL games, because they have naming rights on the stadium in Tampa. The reason I'm mentioning Raymond James is that they have had a profound effect on my entire career since then, because what I came to understand was that was the place where I felt the most nurtured, taken care of, and supported in my entire professional career, other than, self-employment. But so I went to this company, and from the very beginning, I could tell that a lot of people had my back, not just my manager, not just, I made a lot of friends. I still have friends to this day from that company. There were people who were willing to, who were coming up to me and offering to help. And I got to know the executives of the company. I trusted them. I knew what they stood for. I felt wonderful. And I kind of knew that not every company was like this, but that personal experience was one that I kind of expected that I would have as I continued my career. Along the way, I did a lot of work after I left Raymond James as an external consultant, working, supporting other companies, a variety of companies, global companies, and things having to do with building organizational cultures, leadership development, employee engagement, a variety of things. Assessment. I shouldn't forget, lots of work in the assessment space. And one of the things, especially as the years went by and I worked with more companies as an employee again, one of the things I really figured out was that a lot of CEOs, a lot of HR leaders were really not focused on the experience of the individual employee. Of course, if you're running an HR department, you've got to focus on risk and compliance and so on. So those things are essential. But I noticed an opportunity for more leaders to focus on the employee experience and put the employee experience in the center of everything that they did. And so when I went to IBM, taking all of the experiences I had already had, and because IBM, I was working in a part of the business where we were helping our clients do research on employee opinions, and then helping the leaders of those companies figure out what to do with these data to help drive manager and leader effectiveness, because manager and leader effectiveness drives the employee experience. I got to see firsthand across a range of global companies how there were levers that could be pushed and pulled that could have a positive outcome for not just the employee, but also, of course, you're still having the financial and business outcomes that you desire. So it was that job, and working in that organization was sort of a convergence of all of the best things, where I could do all the geeky things that IO psychologists like to do, but I could also advise executive leaders, which is another thing that I absolutely love to do. And I was working in a company itself, IBM, where there were a lot of good things happening on behalf of employees. We had a female CEO. One could not help but be impressed by this person. Ginny Rometty was someone who I admired because she made it very clear what the strategic priorities of the company were. And at the same time, there were many things that IBM was doing that I thought were solidly putting the employee at the center of the experience. So I was advising leaders on things that I was personally experiencing. And let me just mention one of those right off the bat, because I know that IBM's work in P-Tech continues to this day, where when that is an organization that has had a very, very long history of focusing on issues pertaining to diversity and inclusion, pioneers with regard to gender equity, pioneers with regard to racial and ethnic equity as well in that organization. And one of the things that IBM did when I was there that I felt, sort of a personal stake in, even though I had nothing to do with creating it, was when Gena Rometty invested in the P-Tech program, where students from underrepresented groups could graduate from high school, could do the kind of work then in sort of a junior college type of situation, if you want to call it that. They would be exposed to these kinds of technical skills in depth. They could then come to work for the companies, and learn right next to an experienced engineer and develop these skills so that in just a few years after graduation, they were fully ready to, for a career in tech. So putting employee experience at the center is something I care about on a personal level, and I love it when companies do it as well.
Well, it sounds like it's a very beneficial experience, and it's interesting to me to see that you can learn a lot from a bad company. And sometimes when you're working for a good company, you aren't necessarily so aware of how good that company is. You just sort of want to stay there. And it's when, at a bad company, it really is so uncomfortable, and you can really pinpoint those things. So obviously coming in with the understanding and the degree that you did, obviously that gave you a huge amount of understanding, and maybe be able to sort of really focus on the different elements that were working. What are the other elements that you found in terms of, in addition to these specific areas about diversity and inclusion, that you felt were key to building out some cultural foundational elements that really made that an environment for you and new people, as you're saying, whether they're engineers or marketing people, wherever they may be coming in from, to really feel that that's the place that they can excel and really do well in.
That's interesting. So probably because you will have heard this over the years, but I know this from research and also experience, that the manager is at the center of employee experience. So even in the most sophisticated organizations, the biggest ones, really my experience as an employee always depends on what is it that my manager is doing to support me or not. And I was really lucky then that my personal experience at IBM was positive because of the managers with whom I had the opportunity to work with at the company. One of the strengths of that company, and I don't need to just focus on IBM, but one of the strengths of that company is that they really take leader and manager development, very seriously. They understand that to the extent that a manager is effective as a communicator, brings people together to share ideas, provides psychological safety in the work environment. And by psychological safety, I'm simply referring to the idea that when I show up, if there's something that I want to say, either on behalf of my personal, of myself, or an idea that I want to share to help the business, that the manager will make, space for that. That when I want to share ideas, even when they might be something with which the manager, disagrees, that I will feel safe sharing those ideas. That managers who create those kinds of environments create engagement. Employees are more engaged, and they create inclusion. So I've had the luck over the years to have some great managers who do those things. And of course, I've also had managers who didn't do those things. So when I think about what drives engagement, and what drives inclusion and what doesn't. Some of the behaviors that do not support those two outcomes are when managers, for example, have sort of cliques where there are certain people who get information before other people in the group. The manager is not even necessarily aware that they're doing this. Or in situations where there are opportunities for projects that arise that could offer political clout or higher visibility, but only certain people get to hear about those opportunities. They aren't communicated to the whole team so that everybody can participate. Or when jobs come open where it would be a promotion or a pay increase and an opportunity for growth, not making sure that everybody hears about those opportunities in time to participate. Another common behavior from managers that gets in the way of both engagement and inclusion is when, a manager would sort of be in a situation where what they're wanting to do is maybe they say that there's something that they feel is confidential, that they can't really share it with everyone yet, but somehow they manage to share it with one or two of the people that are their sort of go-to people, and then the word eventually leaks out, and others say, well, how come those two people knew and nobody else knew? I think the point that I'm making here, of course, is just that managers really have a big impact on employee experience, an outsized impact, and often they're not aware of it.
Right. It's such an important point, particularly right now when we're when so many people are working remotely, and managers are the key conduit of information and the employee experience for so many people who are working from home. And they are the gatekeeper for developing relationships and sort of understanding what the prospects are, going further up the company and sort of people developing their potential. So I think, managers, their importance has got even more important with the sort of the current pandemic situation. And so there were elements that you talked about which were very tactical, but obviously, a strategic, very much a strategic theme there in terms of how managers and leaders above them can be thinking about inclusion and what that means as being an integral piece of the sort of the culture. You then went to another company, Perceptics, is that correct? Yeah, and so what was the difference in terms of what you were doing? How were you applying your understanding of the employee experience and the different elements that could be tweaked and helping companies integrate their different mindsets and different approaches for the benefit of employees and obviously the bottom line too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was doing a lot of similar things at Perceptics to what I did at IBM. One difference is that Perceptics had really superior technology. I'm sure Perceptics is hearing me say this because I believe it. And what that means is that and Perceptics is a technology company first. When you work in a technology company where the technology does what it's supposed to do, as an industrial psychologist, it gives you more room to really focus on that, okay, where do we go from here? Now that we've got the insights that the technology can deliver. And so loving, of course, all those opportunities to work directly with executives to really guide them on the things that they could and should do to help drive employee experience, that continued to be a part of it. And being really clear about specifically manager effectiveness, because again, even executives underestimate the things that managers should be doing in order to define what looks like a good employee experience. I like to tell leaders that when I think of managerial performance, I don't just think of did they hit the financial outcomes, because I know that you can't keep a business going if you don't make money. But here's the thing. I think of it as, imagine if you've got like a pie chart. So you've got this big circle and you've got some triangles in there. What tends to happen is that leaders really focus disproportionately on the part of the circle that has to do with task performance, the part that has to do with, did we get the widgets done? Did we do this thing for the client? And so on. They need to do that. But then there's this other piece of the pie. I don't know what percentage it should be or is in every company, but let's say that the two things should be 50-50, right? I know that this is not what leaders are taught in MBA programs, because in fact, I think many people who graduate from our top MBA programs aren't taught enough about the human part of this whole leadership thing. But let's say it was 50-50. Let's even say that the task performance was 75%. The bottom line is there is a chunk that has to do with the human experience. And a lot of managers don't pay any attention to it, or certainly they don't pay enough attention to it. And so what happens is, in the work that I would do, I would always try to make sure that their executives understood that you ought to be holding managers accountable, because especially when you look at data, if you look at employee data by, let's say, business unit or department or by geography, you know who the leaders are in those departments, business units, and geographies where the scores are lower. And probably, about 70% of the variance in experience of an employee has to do with their manager experience. So when you see those lower numbers, you ought to be figuring out what are the managers doing there that is so different, that is having a negative impact on employees, and what can you do to turn that around. Those are some of the things that I was doing that would give me a great deal of fun. That would be a great deal of fun for me. And Perceptics had also started to do work in the diversity and inclusion space. It had always done that work, I should say. It came to the fore as a result of certainly the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. So I was doing more work having to do with, thinking about, well, what should we measure in the employee experience so that our clients would know, are there issues pertaining to diversity and inclusion within their organizations? So we were doing work in sort of designing what should be measured and how it should be measured, and then how should we guide our clients to think of inclusion as a strategic consideration.
Right. So to that, I'd love to, Gena, thank you to, in terms of just to take a sort of sidebar to dovetail into this discussion in terms of your experience moving to the States, and because I think from our discussion before, that really did have a big impact on you in terms of what the experience of what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so forth, how you particularly reacted and how that affected you, and therefore changed your journey and where you are now, because it's so important.
Oh, thank you, Sophie. Wow. This is a big deal here. It's a big deal for me, and a big deal for a lot of people who look like me. So, I was born in England, and I grew up in the Caribbean, in Barbados. And when I came to the United States, I was 20 years old. So basically, I had formed my identity. I knew who I thought I was, and who my friends thought I was, and who my family thought I was. And what people thought, and who people thought I was in Barbados was, a smart person who was a good girl, and friendly and very funny sometimes. They thought that I was somebody who really was focused on putting good vibes out into the world, because I would always say that, and that is really who I am. So when I came to the United States, it didn't take long for me to discover that when I would show up in certain spaces, the reaction that I would get would indicate that people were seeing me in a way that was 180 degrees different than the way that I saw myself. It's really an interesting thing. It's like a natural experiment, if you would. There is the before of, oh, this is Gena. And then there's this other thing of like, who are they talking about? What is that about, right? Of course, I was about 21 years the first time that someone called me the N-word, a word that I had previously only ever seen in a book. So it was no longer an abstraction. And once that happens, I think you mark the point in time where you hear this kind of thing directed at you, and you realize, wait a minute, this is real. So I think coming to the United States has had a profound effect on me, and there's been a great deal of upside. I came here as a student. I came here to study. I came here to be a thought leader. There's been a great deal of upside. The other side of it, though, is that for my entire professional career in corporate America, I have done my very best not to talk about race or ethnicity, not about my own, and not about anyone else's, because the sort of the rule, I think, that you typically would follow is, Why talk about something that is clearly not understood and that tends to generate a great deal of negative feeling whenever it comes up? Who really wants to have that experience as the first thing people think when you show up? So I have done a pretty good job of avoiding conversations about race and ethnicity, my own experiences in the United States. And the thing about that, I call it wearing a mask. The thing about that is that then in the middle of a pandemic, when George Floyd was killed, well, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then George Floyd, because 2020 was quite a doozy of a year, I became a completely different person. So the person that you see in front of me, in front of you today, is really not the same person that existed, March 25th of 2020. The experience was extremely profound, extremely traumatic. And I didn't even know that until the night of the BET Awards. I watch the BET Awards every now and then. I don't always watch it, but I watched it that year and I was alone. It was late at night and a young man came on. His name is Kedron Bryant, I believe. If I got it wrong, I apologize. But he sang this song, and the song is I Just Want to Live. And if you ever look this up and you see this young man, I think he's only like about 17 years old, singing this song, I Just Want to Live. And I was already processing whatever I was processing. Well, all I can tell you, Sophie, is that on that particular day, I just lost it. And in a way, I looked in the mirror and I said, you've been working all these years on organizational dynamics and helping leaders, but you have been pretending every day that you aren't having these experiences. And you're a bit of a hypocrite. So, Gena, what you really need to do is take everything that you know and see how you can use it in service of helping organizational leaders become more confident and comfortable in talking about issues of diversity and inclusion, and then helping them figure out how to solve the challenges that fall into that bucket, if you would, in their own organizations. So immediately I said, I'm going to focus all of my energy for the rest of my professional career on really trying to change the world, one employee at a time, from the perspective of bringing people together in work situations where no one feels like they are invisible.
Gena, thank you for sharing that very powerful story. There was also something as part of that you mentioned to me in terms of what you had felt the choices were, if you're okay sharing this, what you felt the choices were for you in terms of the ways that you could approach your life, the opportunities. I think you said either to give up or just sort of yield to the limited options that you had for yourself. That really struck me in terms of coming from the outside. And I myself, as a Brit, having grown up in England as well, we experience these things so differently when we come to new places from the outside. So taking that perspective that you have, you're now starting up your own company, and you're now an inclusion strategist. What does that mean from a strategic level? How do you approach bringing inclusion from a strategic level, bringing this perspective that you have from the outside and knowing what people are, what their experiences are, how they're experiencing from all perspectives, and how are you helping them change from a cultural level, in that strategic, integrating new ways of thinking, new mindsets from a strategic point of view, as well as the tactics, which are obviously important too on a daily basis to get people changing. But the strategic shift is critical.
Mm-hmm. It is. So I'm not going to start the conversation talking about inclusion. I'm actually going to start my response by talking about strategic talent management. So here's the thing. Imagine then a CEO and a C-suite team establish a business strategy. This is what we want to accomplish. These are the desired outcomes. This is the time frame. We're going to make a lot of money. We're going to win in the marketplace. And it all seems very reasonable. And some time goes by and they start to notice that they're not getting the outcomes they desire. Well, they'll go to the sales department. Why aren't you selling more? Then they'll go to the marketing department. What do we need to do to increase demand? They'll go to the finance department. Are we sure that we're understanding these numbers? Where have we not done collections? What is the reality at this point in time? They'll go to product development and say, perhaps we need to create new things so that we can increase the demand, ramp up the demand and get more of this thing and sell more of this thing. Those are the places they will typically look. Executive teams do not typically in that conversation look at the talent and say, is talent a part of the potential solution or explanation for why we are not seeing the desired outcome? That seems to me like a no-brainer, but that is not what happens, right? So you notice I said sales, marketing, finance, and product development. I was very clear why I said those. Even customer service would be in there. That was intentional. I didn't mention HR. So what happens is when leaders are trying to solve strategic problems about a business, they tend to be missing a piece of the pie from the very beginning. So what happens if, imagine, this piece of the pie that they're not including in their strategic analysis, the talent, what happens if when they took the time to talk to these employees, what they might discover is that the group of folk that are responsible for creating putting the innovation into the product, they discover that they are overworked for whatever reason. They're burnt out. They've been doing who knows what to try to get this thing done, and they can't do anymore. What if they discover, like a large global financial services company that I won't name by name, but has been in the news in the last couple of weeks, where you had associates working 98 hours, an average of 98 hours a week, and getting 5 hours of sleep a day? What if that was the reality? What if they discovered, if they looked into this further, that there were people who were responsible for creating the product, but what those individuals were experiencing was that they weren't getting the raw materials on time, or they were working in an environment where there were safety considerations and they weren't able to do the best job? And then what if they discovered that some part of the population, the people of color, let's say, or the women, or those with disabilities, whatever, what if they discovered that there was a group of people in the organization who, by virtue of their difference, were not able to perform to their best capabilities, and that this was happening consistently since this company started? What if they knew that? Well, if they knew those things, and if they could fix those things, it's very likely that they might be able to get what they would call the business strategy back on track. So when I think about what does inclusion have to do with strategy, what I'm thinking about here is that it is the experience of an employee throughout all aspects of the business operation that really determines if the strategy will work. And that inclusion is just a slice of that. If your female employees don't have flexibility, especially now, I was just working on an article about the return to work. And women are going to be are wondering, well, what are we going to do? We don't want to go back to business as usual. We need a job. Our childcare arrangements might have been disrupted, so they're not exactly the same as they were before. And I don't feel like pretending anymore like this was ever good. Like, I need a job. I want to do the best, but it doesn't really work. All of these things, these aspects are aspects of what I call, really understanding how the talent fits into the strategy. So strategic inclusion is not like some sort of thing that one goes off and does on the side, where over the years, traditionally, when the topic of diversity and inclusion came up, there would be someone, usually in a human resources department, sometimes a chief diversity officer, if the company was lucky to have one, where the executive team would sort of throw the hot potato to the chief diversity officer and say, fix it. Meanwhile, marketing, sales, product development, and all these other functions that are supposedly running the business have no idea what's going on over here. And the reason they don't have any idea is because they don't think it matters to them. So the first piece of strategic inclusion is just putting this all back together and making the pie a whole.
I love the way that you've put that. And it really goes to the heart of how I feel about the sort of trifecta actually of human resources, IT, and actually also facilities management, HR, IT, and FM, as being how you're going to having a strategic seat at the table, because without really, a talent management strategy, without thinking about IT rather than being a cost center, as being the strategic platforms and tools and applications that are going to enable the people who actually get the work done, how they're going to do it and do it effectively wherever they're working from. And then also the work environments, whether they are people working from home or having the spaces that they need to be able to work effectively, and depending on what project they're doing. So thank you for really putting the heart of strategy, the heart of HR, right into that C-suite is effectively what you're saying, because it goes to, it was, I think 2019, although that feels like 5 years ago, when the World Economic Forum, I think for the first time said, on the top 10 list of skills that one needed or attributes one needed, emotional intelligence was there for the first time. And they also said that the two groups of skills that every person needed going forward to be effective as we moved into the fourth industrial revolution were basic technical skills and interpersonal skills. And for me, that empathy, it was empathy, negotiation, communication, that's all to do with inclusion, being able to connect with and understand and work with anybody and everybody, and making sure that the sort of two-dimensional cutouts that we turned up as was sort of relatively superficial, like that's not going to cut it anymore in the ways that we have to work together, and the ways that we have to work much more closely together and understand everybody's context. Mm-hmm. So how you're thinking about how we need to really, executives and leaders and managers need to be shifting how their full mindset in terms of how important inclusion is to get it's going right to that employee experience. We're going full circle again. So how have you been seeing? I know that you made this transition relatively recently. How have you found the reception? Because we are in a very different place. The pandemic has churned up emotions, made us all more vulnerable, dealing with war emotions, and I believe more open to discussions about how we can make everybody feel more welcome and safe and belonging. What are you finding?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say two things about that, maybe more than two, but the first thing I'll say on a personal level is that I am more fulfilled than I have ever been in my entire professional life, which is really all that matters. It's the one time that I would say that being completely selfish in my goal and my purpose is okay. Even if I didn't get a warm welcome or response, I would know that night when I was sitting in the sofa watching that thing on television on BET, I remember it will never leave me. And every day I know that I'm doing something that is going to help. So there's that. But from a professional perspective, it's been an extremely positive experience. And I'm not surprised, because though I am purpose-driven in what I'm trying to do, I'm also pragmatic, and I'm not all that, I'm smart enough to have thought this through and have done some planning. The demand is great, because I just got off a call just before this meeting. I was telling you, Sophie, that leaders are what I just described and sort of rattled off, because I have a point of view on this that I hold very strongly, is something that a lot of leaders haven't given any thought to, haven't thought this way. And so it is a mindset shift. And so when leaders talk to me now and I have that conversation, they go, they have those aha moments that go, oh, I never thought about that, which is fascinating. Because it should not necessarily be it's not all that much of a rocket science to think about the whole business that way, but it is a new point of view. So I have been getting a positive response to that. And of course, I think that traditionally leaders are so far. If you look at the data that has come out about what leaders are doing since May of 2020, since March of 2020, really, with the pandemic, and then May of 2020, I think leaders are doing a lot of things. They're doing all the things. The challenge is, are they doing any of the right things? And I see a lot of evidence that they are doing things that are not having the desired impact. That is, if the desired impact is, number one, to enhance what I call inclusion, which simply is described, as you said it before, making sure that every employee who comes into this company or who is a prospect, a candidate, can feel as if he or she can sort of show up, be his or her best, to be authentic, and get supported to perform the work, to grow in their career, and to have relationships with whom they work. If that's the desired outcome, I don't know how much the needle has moved. And that would be inclusion. And if you want to talk about the diversity needle, well, that's a whole other thing. Because I do know that organizations are hiring more people of color. Yay! I think, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead, please do. But what I would say about that is, if you hire more people of color into an organization where the culture does not support the inclusion that I was just describing, you're going to just end up with a lot more people who are very unhappy, because you've got to build a culture of inclusion to support that feeling that I was describing that I had at Raymond James. You don't get that just because you hire, more people of color. So I guess I had something to say about that. I guess I did.
Yes, I think you certainly did. And I think hiring with more diversity in mind obviously there's more comfort there, that there are more people who look like me. There's more understanding through the interactions. And I think there's also that very important piece of it, which is no longer any silence on part of the white people in terms of speaking up and helping there be a safer space, and being active in helping sort of create that sense of community and that sense of trust between everybody. The idea of anti-racism is something that I've educated myself on, and believe it's the key way forward to really start to change because there's so many elements to creating the environment that's actually going to be welcoming and nurturing of every single person, so that they can feel comfortable. You can have the difficult conversations during this transition period where people are learning and engaging in different ways than they have before. And I think the discomfort that some of that does engender. I've had my own uncomfortable moments trying to understand and understand my role, what I've done, what I know, and I think having the environment where there is a lot of vulnerability enables more people to go through that experience together with their coworkers, and I think it's not easy. But none of this is easy, and it's so important to be making progress here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And Sophie, I'm glad that you're doing on your own personal journey, because these are important matters. And something tells me in a way that it helps that you came from another country yourself, because I do think that part of the challenge that we're trying to solve for at a societal level has this long tail of history that is driving it. And I think the reason I have clarity about these things to the extent that I do, like the Barbados versus US experience, that helps me to know it doesn't have to be this way. And you know what I mean? I absolutely know that. But if this is the only experience you have had in the United States, if this is the place you've lived since birth, right, then you might not know, for example, as I do very clearly, that the history that's being taught in schools is incomplete. You might not know that the reason somebody doesn't know what Juneteenth is, and and never heard of it before is because you only get taught that if you go to a school where you have a Black teacher or where the students are primarily Black and you're taught African American history. There is no such thing as African American history, though. There is history of America and everything that has happened in it. And history of America starts whenever, I'm no historian, so please, but it didn't start, at a point in time that begins with the Liberty Bell. It obviously goes way back. The 1619 Project is one where, it's easy to remember that we're talking about centuries. And whenever I talk about any of these matters, I do like to say that, okay, I'm a Black woman. And when you see me, that's what you will see. And that's who I am. But I'm also very much attuned to the fact that all people of color are talking about these very things. The other thing I'm attuned to is that it's only, is it a week ago, that Deb Haaland was confirmed as Secretary of the Interior. She's the first Native American woman in a United States cabinet. And she's also the first Native American woman to head the Interior. And the Department of Interior, of course, manages the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That is a fact that is so mind-blowing but it is important in this conversation because I can't show up in a space and talk about inclusion and diversity and not talk about that, like the fact of this is why it's hard. This is why it's not just about the Black experience, although there's a particular experience of the Black experience, which I certainly have no intention of minimizing because I unfortunately know exactly what that is. But it's, this is huge. And so when we understand the facts of the situation, when we know that, you've got so many wonderful resources in terms of intellectual capabilities of humans that we're not using, then it's a big issue, but we can cross this bridge. I'm 100% sure about that. I'm going to help.
Well, I'm thrilled that you're going to help because I think the perspectives that you bring, and yes, I agree with you that having worked in and lived and worked in 4 other different countries prior to coming to the US has really helped me understand, what it's like when you're not living in your own country. Mm-hmm. I've lived in Hong Kong and Germany, Italy, and in France, and the different aspects of culture and what the expectations are, what the norms are, really, can sometimes be in sometimes what appears more familiar surroundings, but then it's actually much less familiar, and they can be discordant. But then I certainly started to learn and appreciate and empathize with where I was, and really try and assimilate to try and understand better where I was so that I could fit in, and embrace where I was, but also respecting the who I was, who everybody else was, and trying to be as much of who I was when I as I could. Yeah. So I think what your perspectives, what you're bringing to the table, and the conversations that you're having. How does that work in terms of when you're helping create that mindset shift? How does that work on a practical basis? If people who are watching now, how can they make some of their first steps, or second and third and fourth steps on a daily basis, as well as embrace a new shift in how they're approaching this?
Yeah. Let me back up and say one other thing. We talked about, when you were talking about the places in which you have lived, it reminded me that, again, as I said before, whenever I want to have this conversation, I like to talk about Indigenous people and Native Americans and so on, not because I am that knowledgeable about their experience, because I am not, but I have certainly studied it, and I'm fascinated by the reality. But I have a friend, a colleague, her name is Ludmila Prazilova. And Ludmila focuses on those who have who are neurodiverse. I'm trying to use the right language because she has really informed my point of view. And so Ludmila talks about, for example, helping leaders understand these same issues on the, from the perspective of people who are on the autism spectrum or who identify as autistic, for example. And I have learned so much from her about this whole idea, because the point that I think you were also driving to when you were talking about the countries is that what we're really talking about is that differences are differences, but differences doesn't mean you can't do the job or you can't belong or fit in or whatever, right? Okay, so I have an accent. Darren Manabni is somebody else I know who does a lot of work with helping leaders just understand that if you're running a global business, you're going to have people who are in France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States. You're going to have people in Japan and China, and they're going to all not just have different languages, but different norms about, do you speak up or do you stay quiet? Do you like PowerPoint or should you put it in written word? I mean, whatever the difference. You don't look at people and say, oh, because they came from another country and have the accent, you shouldn't assume that means they're inferior and can't do the job. So the whole concept of difference, I don't know why it takes on these gargantuan proportions in our culture and in others. But the question that you actually asked before I went off on that, because I did want to say that I am fully aware, again, every time I show up, I am talking about all of that because all of that is the experience that matters. I did want to say, though, that yes, there are things you can do. So business leaders, I've already given some clues about what business leaders can do, because the truth is, I simply believe that business leaders have not been paying attention to that slice of the strategic pie. And I think that gives you a clue about what you could do differently, just as a starting point. But on an individual basis, one of my favorite writers is Maya Angelou. She is not only one of my favorite, everybody likes Maya Angelou. Who doesn't like Maya Angelou? I liked Maya Angelou ever since I was a teenager and saw her and thought, oh, wow, I see. She's somebody that, maybe we have something in common. I don't know, although our upbringing was so different. But Maya Angelou tells the story. I've heard her tell it many times, of course, on television, where if she is at a dinner table, wherever she is, but especially in her home, if she brings you to her home and the 8 of you are sitting around for dinner and she says, I have this radar. If I hear somebody 2 tables, 2 chairs down, say something demeaning about another person, I stop. Not in my house. Not in my house. She says, I will not tolerate people around me saying demeaning things about other people, especially on the basis of race, gender, or any of the other differences that we have been discussing. But most people don't do that because they're afraid, they lack the courage, they want to fit into the peer group. But if you are around people who say demeaning things about their coworkers on the basis of any of these differences that we're discussing, what you really have to ask yourself is, are you part of the solution or you're making the problem worse? I have a point of view. You're making the problem worse because you've now given permission for somebody to say it's okay to do that. If a member of a group says to you, for example, that there's a word that they would prefer that you not use because when you use the word, it makes them feel less than and othered and therefore excluded, then consider not using the word. It's not that big of a deal. I told a friend of mine recently when she asked me to look at something, she had used the word tribe. I have no idea what the official stance is on the use of that word. And I am not a member of an indigenous group in this country, but I don't use that word because the word means something. It does mean a very specific thing, but it doesn't just mean getting a bunch of people together on social media to have a lot of fun and to influence, getting more likes in social media. That's not what a tribe is. So I don't use that word. One of the other things, I'll tell you a quick story that I think encapsulates some of these things. People have to be aware of the things that they don't do and do not know. I remember one time I worked in this company in a beautiful building, and I had been talking to this attorney for weeks by telephone. He was also a co-worker in another building. And for whatever reason, we needed to get together face to face to talk about the work. So I'm working in my office and I see somebody, we set a time, but I'm working in my office and I see someone walk back and forth and back and forth, but I'm working. I know this guy's going to come to see me, but so eventually this person who I really wasn't looking at the person stopped in front of my door, stuck their head in and said, do you know where to find Dr. Gena Cox? I said, you're looking at her. He said, oh. And he couldn't see me. He could not see me as Dr. Gena Cox. And okay, so I didn't need to give him a lecture about that at all, and I did not. But my point is, when you are in a situation where you're around people who have difference, who might not look like you, they might be autistic, they might be left-handed. Left-handed people, like my husband, are very, very different. I tell him that all the time. What difference does it make? Okay, just do what you have to do. And if you do say something that is a little awkward, there's no problem with apologizing. But again, I need to be really clear that while we're talking about these personal things, because I am an inclusion strategist for organizations, I think it's the organization's obligation to deal with these issues on a systemic level, not on a personal level. So I'm not a big fan of implicit bias training. Implicit bias training has a purpose. If the purpose is just to raise awareness, it does that. If you think that it's going to change behavior, it doesn't do that. So I focus more on helping leaders to figure out what are the biases built into your standard processes and procedures that are perpetuating this problem that we're now trying to solve for. Because if you've been in business for 50 years, 25 years, 10 years, and what I know from the data is that the hiring rates for people of color have not improved since the 1960s, well, then you can't say there isn't a problem. So now what is it that we look at to solve? It's not implicit bias at the individual level. That's not what I want the CEO to focus on so much. You can still do that. Focus on the policies and practices. Where do you advertise your jobs? When people show up as candidates for the jobs, what are the barriers that you're putting in front of them to eliminate them from consideration? You could blind the resumes like, the symphony orchestras do, so that you don't know more about them than focusing on the things that really matter, that are the valid criteria that would predict performance. One of the interesting things that you could do is make sure that your managers aren't reviewing resumes 8 o'clock at night while they're watching a movie and drinking a glass of wine. That is a silly example that I throw in there, but here's the thing. That actually is quite serious, because people are because this is about decision making, and people are less likely to make valid decisions when they're under the influence of a nice Cabernet. But apart from the fun of that, that's just one little example that I was talking about in the hiring. But think about the processes for promotion. Did I even know that the job was going to come open that was going to pay $10,000 more per year? Did I get a chance to apply? How do you go about that whole process? Do I get any feedback? Do you give feedback to me so that I can grow? If you see me doing something wrong, what tends to happen with people of color is we don't get as much feedback. So even when we do something that could be improved, the manager is either afraid or reluctant to say, Gena, I noticed that you did this thing. I bet you didn't know that if you push lever 1 and lever 2 instead of levers 3 and 5, you get more thing coming out of the widget machine. That's feedback, right? It's right. Not going to hurt my feelings. All I'm going to do with that is like, oh my gosh, I've been pressing the wrong levers. Let me go over here, right?
It's great to hear all of these different ways that people can be thinking about it. And the sort of thread that goes through all of those is being intentional about thinking all the different ways that the how one can be acting, behaving in a slightly different, moving in a different direction that is going to be more inclusive and welcoming of everybody. It's been so powerful, all the different things that you've shared with us. Is there anything that I haven't, as we wrap up, is there anything that I haven't asked you? There are so many insights you've shared, and there's so many sort of thoughtful things and great stories as well. What one last thing that you would like to share with people who are watching in terms of inclusion, thinking about this differently, the perspectives, education, what haven't I asked?
Well, I think, Sophie, that you've asked almost everything that could be asked. I think you've been, as I expected, a very incisive interrogator. No, just kidding. But here's my perspective on all of this. The way that you're seeing me today is how I show up. And the reason I show up this way, well, apart from the fact that this is my personality, is that I want every other human with whom I interact to always leave having had a good experience with Gena. That's sort of my goal. I don't always accomplish that, but that's my goal. With regard to these matters, I want every leader to know that he or she can be empowered to get through, to understand what they can do differently to make things better. And actually what I've tried to convey today is that the reason I say inclusion strategist and I don't say diversity strategist or something else, is this is really part and parcel of what you're doing every day. So I just want to make sure that leaders get the support that they need to do the things that they need to do. And the individuals when someone reaches out your hand to me, I will always respond. I always say that. And on a personal level, let's just keep doing what we can to keep making things better. And I'm highly optimistic. I would say that, Sophie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gena. Gena Cox, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. Her Twitter handle is @Gena Cox, GenaCox.
Gena with an E. Don't ask me why.
GenaCox. So please connect with her, follow her. There are so many amazing things that she's doing as she ramps up, helping organizations all over really shift their mindsets and think about inclusion in a really strategic way. Thank you so much, Gena, for your time.
It's been a lot of fun. Bye, Sophie. Bye, everybody.
Bye. I've lost my... It's not closing this.